All right. Well, good morning. So I'm Sigan Hartley and Wasteland Center investigator here, as well as associate professor in the School of Human Ecology on campus. And I'm thrilled to be part of this event this morning. One quick disclaimer and that this applies to all the presentations today. We are using a platform which is not confidential. So please keep this in mind when sharing questions or comments in the chat. And please refrain from sharing private health information. Also, all the information that we're sharing today is for informational purposes only. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. And we encourage you to always seek the advice of your healthcare provider with any questions you may have. All right. Well, today I'm going to highlight what we know about some cognitive and behavioral challenges and strengths across the life course in Down syndrome. And I want to start by highlighting at a broad level what we know about cognitive and behavioral functioning. In terms of overall cognitive functioning, we know that most individuals with Down syndrome score in the mild to moderate range of intellectual disability on IQ measures. However, we know that there's a lot of important variability. So for example, about 10 to 15% of individuals score in the severe to profound range. And we know that a small subset score in the borderline to average range. And in part, we know that some of this variability is related to the type of trisomy 21 that individual has. So for example, what you can see to the figure on the right is the distribution of IQ scores for individuals with full trisomy 21, meaning those that have the additional chromosome 21 in all of their cells. It's labeled standard Down syndrome on that figure. Versus those with mosaic Down syndrome, meaning that they only have the triplication of chromosome 21 in some of their cells. And what we can see is that there is large overlap in cognitive ability, but on average, we see a slightly higher cognitive score for those with the mosaic form. We also know that some of this variability is going to be related to services, education, and training individuals receive across their life. In terms of behavior, at a broad level, we know that individuals with Down syndrome are at an increased risk for maladaptive behaviors or mental health problems compared to their same age peers who don't have Down syndrome. However, we also see, again, important variability. The majority of adults with Down syndrome don't qualify for a mental health disorder. And we also know that there's many types of mental health problems we don't tend to see in this population. And so what I want to focus on for the rest of my talk here is more what are the strengths and challenges that we see that tend to be unique to Down syndrome. All right, so let's start with the cognitive profile that we see in infancy and toddlers. In terms of challenges, we see that infants tend to show reduced vocal reactivity and responsiveness. So this means that it may take them longer to react or to respond to others or their environment. We also see limited inhibitory processes, meaning the ability to regulate their attention or their emotion relative to their same age peers. We do see a delay in babbling, so the ba, 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 or those early sort of vowel consonant sounds. However, babbling and first words, actually, we do see sometimes occurring still in that typical range. And we do see a delay in terms of single and even two words. However, again, sometimes they actually are in that typical range. However, with time, we do see greater delays in what we call expressive language in Down syndrome than in children without Down syndrome. Social cognition also tends to be a relative challenge to this group. So this means understanding sort of social problems or some of this social information. So understanding what might be triggering someone's emotion, or understanding if somebody is angry versus sort of sad can be a challenge for this group. Now, in contrast, in terms of the strengths we see with Down syndrome, we see a strong interest in social interactions. And this can be a very powerful learning tool because we often learn the most through interacting with others when we're young. We also see evidence of good joint attention. So this is another strength in Down syndrome. This means the ability to share a common focus with someone else. So for example, by having a parent be able to alert the child to a specific object, a toy, by using gestures, using their eye contact, pointing. This is what we call joint attention, and this is a strength for our group. We also see that relative to typically matched children who have the same vocabulary level, we see what we call a gesturing advantage in Down syndrome, meaning that toddlers with Down syndrome will use more pointing, and they're sort of using these creative approaches to be able to communicate with others. And so that's a big strength to build on. We also see, in terms of strengths, a strength in pragmatic aspects of language. So for example, not only are toddlers with Down syndrome using gestures, but they're often able to get information about from the gestures that parents or others in their environment are using, as well as pick up on some of the information from the tone, for example, of somebody's voice. So, and then finally, visual learning is a big strength for our group, and I'm going to talk more about this in a minute. But what are these different strengths mean in terms of how we could maximize learning? Well, one, it's important to understand that for infants and toddlers, because of this relative weakness or sort of more delay in the expressive communication, they're often able to understand much more than they can say. It may mean allowing more time to respond or react to cues or prompts from adults in their world. It means that using clear, simple phrases and pairing this with visual cues and modeling is going to be much more effective than just using words alone. It also means making sure there's multiple means to communicate available to toddlers and young children with Down syndrome, because sometimes saying the words themselves may be a struggle, but if we can make sure they can use gestures, sometimes language aids, as well as other ways to communicate, that's going to be much more effective. And finally, given this draw to social interactions, making sure that we leverage these positive interactions as ways to learn. Now, in terms of childhood and adolescence, we see a relative weakness in auditory or verbal learning and memory.
Sorry, I'm going to break in and just ask you to slow down just a little bit for the interpreters.
No problem.
Thank you.
So in terms of auditory memory, this is actually a challenge we see across the life course in Down syndrome. And what it means is that the ability to retain information and use it in important ways or flexible ways is much harder for information that individuals with Down syndrome hear. So this becomes a problem if you think about a classroom, right? Where often students are expected to be learning by listening to the teacher. And we know that that is going to be more challenging for children with Down syndrome. Now, in contrast, they have a relative strength in visual learning and memory. So instead of just being able to hear, being able to see, or having somebody model things so they can see the information or see the behaviors we're trying to prompt is going to be a much more effective strategy. Now, we continue to see the delays in expressive language. And in childhood, this often, in particular, where the challenges that we see are in syntax or the ability to use verbs and nouns and use language in a grammatically correct way. We also see intelligibility problems. So the ability to form speech sounds in a way that creates clear and understandable speech is often something that can be more challenging for children and adolescents with Down syndrome. Phonological processing or understanding speech sounds in particular seems to be a relative challenge for this group. So that means that if you think about a word, breaking it down into the number of syllables, for example, is something that's a more challenging construct for this population. We also see relative challenges in executive functions, and I'll explain a little bit more what that means in a minute. In terms of strengths, again, throughout childhood and adolescence, we see that general comprehension, so understanding of directions and understanding of words and vocabulary, it tends to be much more strongly developed than what that individual with Down syndrome themselves may be able to say or their vocabulary. Relative to other individuals who have intellectual disability, social skills tends to be a strength from this group. So there's an interest in interacting with peers, and they tend to be able to do this often a little bit. This tends to be a strength we can draw on. This comes a little bit more easy compared to others who have a same mental age. We mentioned the visual learning and memory. Again, this is a huge strength, and I think this is a really key part in thinking about how he can maximize learning for children and adolescents with Down syndrome. And this includes sight vocabulary. So let me just talk for 1 minute about what it means to sort of use this for learning. Well, it means that thinking about the strength in visual and visual spatial abilities relative to verbal abilities means that we want to do a lot early on, often, of sight learning for vocabulary words. So pairing a picture with that written word to build up a child with Down syndrome's vocabulary and these early building blocks to bridge into reading. It also means that visual schedules. So being able to convey information about what we need to do and when children and adolescents should be doing it by visually putting up a schedule is often going to be a very effective strategy. We also see it in terms of other visual cues that we could use in a classroom or at home to help guide and direct behavior. Because again, these visual cues are going to be easier than just hearing that same information verbally. And we're going to see that modeling. So showing an individual how to vacuum by doing it and walking it through and sort of physically guiding that individual is also going to be a more effective strategy than sitting that individual down and trying to convey how you would vacuum. Now, I mentioned this relative challenge in executive functions. So this is something that, again, we see really across the life course with Down syndrome. And so what does this mean? Well, executive functions are really sort of a set of cognitive abilities. It involves the ability to direct your attentional focus and sustain your attention. So not letting distracting sounds or information get in the way from paying attention to what you should be paying attention to. It involves inhibitory action or the ability to monitor and control your behaviors. So to be able to self-regulate your responses, not just sort of grab something, not just respond to a feeling of frustration, but to be able to calm yourself down to pay attention. It also involves the ability to activate or to plan and organize. And so these are key strategies, if you think about it, in terms of being able to problem solve, being able to manage frustrations, being able to contain information and actually use it because you're paying attention to what you should be paying attention to. So what does this mean for learning? Well, knowing that this tends to be a challenge, a unique challenge for individuals with Down syndrome across the life course, means that we can actually do some things to help foster learning. So for example, speaking directly to that individual with Down syndrome, using clear language, short phrases tends to be more effective. Again, this really strong emphasis on visual learning, which is a relative strength when trying to teach. So visual demonstrations, pictures, illustrations, breaking up information into key points. Also, we know that there's this relative strength in social skills. And so that can be something we can leverage. So having that child with Down syndrome work in a peer group with peers who can help give them the cues and model how to regulate behavior and what activities they should be doing, for example. Repetition can be helpful, as well as breaking up a task into smaller steps can be very helpful. Lots of breaks can help to regulate attention and also emotion. So you have shorter periods where you're trying to get that individual to really sustain attention. And finally, giving explicit directions and cues about how to regulate frustrations or emotions or attention can be really helpful. Now, in terms of adulthood, in terms of challenges that we see, we continue to see auditory memory and learning being more challenging. So this has implications for employment. For example, job coaches using visual cues again to really teach new skills. We continue to see the relative challenge in expressive language, or what you can convey through your words, relative to other areas of adaptive skills. Intelligibility, or the production of sounds, continues to be a relative challenge, as well as executive functions. In terms of the strengths we see, compared to other adults who had the same level of nonverbal abilities, we tend to see a relative strength in daily living skills and employment skills with adults with Down syndrome. We also tend to continue to see the strength in visual spatial abilities, and again, in visual learning and how to learn from what we see. Now, one of the unique things that we see in Down syndrome in terms of cognition and aging is Alzheimer's disease. So we know that adults with Down syndrome are at risk for Alzheimer's disease, and we know that they have an early age of onset. So we see an average age of Alzheimer's disease onset in about the mid-50s. And we know, though, and you can see from the figures on the right, that Alzheimer's disease pathology actually begins to emerge decades before we're going to see the onset of dementia or the cognitive declines or that cognitive impairment that we're going to see. And we know that we see a host of brain changes with Alzheimer's disease. So we see buildup of different proteins which interfere with how our cells function, and thus how we can sort of think and behave. We see atrophy of brain areas, as well as altered use of brain glucose or sort of sugar within the brain. Now, our own research suggests that there's a specific profile in terms of the types of cognitive domains we see impacted with Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome. So we tend to see declines in memory and attention first. This is followed by declines in executive functioning, visual spatial ability, or the ability to sort of draw or think about where things are in space, and visual motor ability, or the ability to sort of see something and use it to move your hands. Finally, we see declines in language and gait, or sort of coordination and walking. Now, we are doing a Alzheimer's, we're part of an Alzheimer's Biomarker Consortium, or ABCDS, here at the Waisman Center. So this is part of a large study. We're one of 8 sites that are located across the United States and in the United Kingdom. I put up Renee Maku, who is our project manager, her information in case we're always looking for interested families and adults with Down syndrome to join our study. And I want to just sort of briefly highlight those pictures on the bottom left here. We recently hired 2 new outreach coordinators to help us make new connections with the Down syndrome community, and in particular, connections with families who have been historically underrepresented and left out of science. And here you can see Maria Noren, and Danny Shavitz, who are two outreach coordinators. And I want to just highlight that when we think about Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome, we actually know that there are some ways that we can help preserve cognitive functioning. And so I just want to highlight three things that we're studying within our study. One is the importance of sleep. So we see really strong associations between people who sleep better, so not having as many disruptions in sleep, and not having sleep apnea or sleep disordered breathing, and executive functioning and memory within adults with Down syndrome. So this tells us that it's really important that adults with Down syndrome are being regularly screened for sleep problems, and to the extent that they can, complying with interventions, things like body positioning or CPAP devices and other good sleep hygiene strategies. We also see important associations between physical activity and executive functioning and memory. So not spending too much time in what we call sedentary behavior or sitting around has important links with memory, and making sure that we do some activities that raises our heart rate enough days in a week also is related to better executive functioning in our group. So building some of these activities into routines can be very important. Finally, we also see that doing things to keep yourself thinking with age can be important. So we see links between adults with Down syndrome who report doing more cognitively stimulating leisure activities and better cognitive functioning with age. And as an example of this, here you can see a poem. So Danny Shavitz, who is one of our outreach coordinators, it does a lot of cognitive stimulation in terms of activities in his day by writing poems. All right, I'm going to, just in the matter of time, I want to highlight just a couple of behavior challenges and strengths, but I know that our next presenter is going to talk a lot about ways to help to leverage these strengths and reduce some of these challenges. So I'm just going to highlight them today. In terms of toddlers and children with Down syndrome, wandering, non-compliant behavior, disruptive behavior tend to be some of the most commonly reported problems by parents. We also see impulsive behaviors or hyperactive behaviors, grabbing, running, tend to be commonly reported, as do anxious and inflexible behaviors. So getting stuck and behaving in a certain way and generally sort of needing reassurance tends to be common. In terms of adolescence, we begin to see more mood issues can come up. So being lethargic, not wanting to do things, low affect, being sad and tearful can happen with depression. We see some more generalized anxiety, just general worries, as well as some sort of fixed or obsessive behaviors. In terms of strengths here, leveraging social skills, leveraging the desire to interact with others, and we see a strength in routines. So the opposite of being fixed in behaviors can be routines, tends to be a strength for this group. So establishing good routines is a great way to alter behavior. And I'll just highlight autism. We do see an increased risk for autism in individuals with Down syndrome. However, only about 5 to 16% across studies of children with Down syndrome would meet criteria for autism. And when we think about who would meet criteria for a dual diagnosis here, we're really going to focus on the subset of behaviors that we don't tend to see in Down syndrome. So for example, we don't tend to see a reduced interest in communicating. We don't tend to see a reduced use of gestures. We don't tend to see sort of social indifference or avoidance of eye contact. And these are things that are more unique to the autism in that black circle. And so that's the part that we would look for if we want to consider a dual diagnosis for this group. All right, in terms of maladaptive behaviors we see for adults, we do see regression. We continue to see mood issues, obsessive compulsive behaviors, and self-talk. I want to just highlight self-talk is a very common concern from parents. We actually know it's very normative in Down syndrome. So in one study, they found that 91% of children and adults with Down syndrome engaged in self-talk. Most of it was directed at themselves, an imaginary friend, they're enacting a scene, working out event that's going to come, or doing it more for entertainment. So in general, it's not seen as maladaptive at all, unless it's sort of self-disparaging. So you're saying negative things about yourself, or it gets to sort of an aggressive tone that begins to interfere with daily life. We see strengths in employment, routines, and social skills. And I just here have in a bubble some of the job titles we see in the adults with Down syndrome from our study. I'll just quick highlight regression. Regression is a sudden or progressive loss of skills. It's still pretty rare. So we see it in about, it really varies, but 1 to 17% of adults with Down syndrome. It happens in late adolescence or early adulthood. There's a range of symptoms that we see, but in general, the common ones are really a decline in what the individual used to be able to do in terms of social skills, adaptive behavior, attention, and sort of mood or emotional stuff. Typically, it's treated with antidepressants or antipsychotic. Typically, we do see a bump back up, but often not to that same level. And just one myth, this is not Alzheimer's disease, it's a separate phenomenon. All right, so I just want to highlight that adults with Down syndrome do have a unique profile of strengths and challenges. And I think one thing we can do is just think about ways to leverage these strengths and reduce the impact of the challenges to enhance quality of life and learning. And what I presented on today are averages. So we know that there's tons of variability among children, among adolescents, among adults with Down syndrome. All right, thank you. And a big shout out. I know we have World Down Syndrome Day coming up. So happy World Down Syndrome Day to all. And I will go ahead and turn it over to our next presenter.